Today we're going to talk about Kendo UI and Angular, something that I've been using for quite some time and am very passionate about. Now in this morning's keynote, one of the requests was that you find 4 other people that don't work at your company that you don't already know. I would love to become one of those 4 people. If you like, feel free to approach me after the talk. But to help you get to know me better for the next 30 minutes or so, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my life story. So it all began in Rapid City region. No, I'm kidding. I'm not going to go into that. But I've been in app dev for 20 years, which is about the upper limit of what I'm told I can brag about it. After that, just say you've been developing for a long time. Otherwise, people might stop listening. I've been working with Kendo UI and Angular since the betas of both projects. And the talk that I'm giving you today is based on principles that we found hands-on with production applications. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with you. You can follow my Twitter feed, Jeremy Lickness. I tweet about these topics that I'm speaking about, and I always say high signal to noise ratio. You'll see a lot of news about Angular, Kendo, web development. You won't see, hey, I just found this place and ate this piece of food. That's not on my Twitter feed, so you won't see any of that. And a little bit about myself at my company, iVision. I'm a principal architect, and that's a number of roles. I actually do delivery, so I write code day to day. I lead a team. I help customers figure out and scope and size projects, and I explore new technologies that we use as solutions for our customers. So having said that, this is my focus for today. First, I want to cover the nuts and bolts about what AngularJS is. And I want to go beyond the typical, here's sort of the libraries you see, and talk about the actual features and functionality. Now, if you haven't used Angular, it'll be a great introduction to what Angular is and does. If you have used Angular, I encourage you to hang on because you might see some patterns or approaches that you haven't run into in your use of Angular. We'll talk about specifically how Angular connects with Kendo UI. So I started a project that had Kendo UI and JavaScript. We made a decision during the project, and I'll tell you some more details about that in a bit, but we switched over to using Kendo with Angular. At that time, there were no directives. There was no automatic glue, but we were very impressed with how Kendo, built from the ground up for HTML5 and JavaScript, exposed everything we needed to plug it into our application. So we had no issues with making that marriage, and now it comes like that out of the box, and I'll show you how that works. And then finally, we'll walk through some of the directives that Telerik provides that actually wire up Kendo UI using the Angular framework. And then at the end, we'll conclude. And with questions and answers, we'll see how much time we have. Always feel free to stop me if you have other questions. I'll hang out in the back after the talk and be happy. Yes?
These slides going to be online?
Yes, I will link you to the slides and the examples. So let's talk a little bit about AngularJS at a high level, especially for those of you not familiar with it. So this is a single-page application framework, and that is a way of providing rich user experience in the browser. In a nutshell, the reasons behind SPA are to provide a consistent experience and not have to completely repaint the page every time the user does something. So more and more there's this demand to access applications anywhere, anytime, from any device. The natural solution to that is a web delivery. And SPA enables desktop-like experiences on the web. It does this through a number of features that are surfaced up, and one of these is expressions. So you're able to tag the HTML markup with different types of expressions, and you can do things like manage conditions, initialize variables, perform computations. So there's a very powerful expression engine that plays into Angular. The second thing, and probably the most well-known aspect of this, is data binding. So Angular provides that, and for those of you who have developed with WPF or with Silverlight applications, and I said in an earlier talk I wouldn't mention Silverlight again, but I did, so there you have it. But you're familiar with the MVV and pattern and view models. And what Angular does is it takes JavaScript objects and it provides that view model functionality. And what we love about that functionality, what I loved about WPF and Silverlight, was the separation of the design concern from the presentation logic concern. And I don't say you necessarily move all of your business logic into the presentation layer, but there are ways that you massage and manipulate and grab data, and then there's ways you present data. And what data binding does for you is it allows you to deal with a list and a selection as a list and a selection and not worry about if it's implemented with a drop-down or a bunch of list items inside an unordered list or as part of a grid. It separates those details for you. Angular provides a container for dependency injection. This is increasingly important when you have very large applications, whether the application itself is large or whether you have a large team. And again, I'll give you stats about the teams that we vetted this on, but when you have those large teams, it becomes more important to be able to take a lot of different components, test them in isolation, but plug them together in the running application, and that's one of the features that Angular provides. Angular provides templates, and there's templates as a concept and there's templates as an actual implementation. So when I say the concept of a template, that's pretty much don't repeat yourself, right? So I want a way that if I'm doing something over and over again, I'd like to have an easy way to contain that in one component and reuse that. So that template might be what we call a filter, and a filter simply is a simple data transformation, so I take data in and I expose it this way. Or it might be something like a directive, where a directive takes UI and behavior and packages it in that single reusable component. And then finally, Angular comes with tools out of the box. Who here has had to write your own direct access to XML document, HTTP, XAML request, whatever object? So I saw a tentative hand in the back. If you want to write cross-browser compatible AJAX calls, you need a library that helps normalize that across browsers. If you want to perform other functions, such as logging, such as iterating with the console in a testable way, Angular provides that. And I mentioned testable. Angular is very testable. So it does things like abstracts the document model, it abstracts the window, and it provides you with a built-in library to make it very easy to do testing on the client. This is a link to a talk, and again, I'll give you the link to the deck, which will have the link to the talk, and we'll have an inception thing going on. But this is a talk focused on these components of Angular. I don't have time to dive into that because I want to talk about how it marries with Kendo, but that's your deeper dive on these concepts I just covered. So let's go ahead and jump into a quick demo for those of you who haven't seen Angular before and wire something up. So what I'm going to do, I just have a fiddle on the screen. And I'm going to add a div and wire in an expression. And of course, if we run this, all it's going to do is provide a div with some weird mustache-looking braces and 1+2. Nothing impressive there. So now what we're going to do, let me make sure I'm on DOM ready. We'll collapse that. So now I'm going to add a reference to Angular. And the easiest way to do this on the fly is to go to the Angular CDN, which is code.angularjs.org. And I'm just going to grab this RC1. If I pop in here, I've got a lot of files to choose from. Here, let me zoom in for you a little bit. So I've got several components of Angular. I'm just going to grab this minified version and paste that in. Now, simply pulling in Angular isn't going to do much for me. I just ran it again, and you saw no change. But if I make one subtle tweak to this div, and I just add this ng-app, and I run that, now you see suddenly it's evaluated the expression. So 1 + 2 is 3, and what we get is the output of that expression. So this is a template, these braces. Inside of it is an expression, and this is what we call a directive. This is where we get the concept. So on the Angular site, they'll tell you they teach HTML new tricks. So this is a new trick that I can tag an element and say that everything inside of this element is now part of an Angular app. So let's take this a little bit farther. So what I'm going to do is create another div, use another directive, and this time I'm going to ask it if 1 triple equals 1, show 1 triple equals 1. I'm also going to do another div and do triple equal with a quoted 1. And anyone who is familiar with the nuances of JavaScript knows how this may turn out. So we'll click run, and as expected, we get exactly one of those divs, not both. That was an expression. I had it evaluate a condition, and you can see even though you can't put pure JavaScript inside these expressions, it's a very JavaScript-like syntax, so it's easy to use and understand. And finally, no Angular demo is complete without this piece of magic. I'm going to put an input tag, which by itself would be quite boring. I'm going to add another directive called ngModel. And let's call that model something. And then I'm going to give you an h1 tag and use that something inside the h1 tag. So now when we click run and I type, provided I type correctly, we get data binding in the browser. So that's how easy it is. Of course, no application is ever going to be that simple, so I'm going to go one layer deeper and talk about how we make that work. But these are the things out of the box you get, and you can see that with just a simple include and a simple directive, I get a rich set of features. So now I'm going to jump into a project that I built to show you a little iterative process of building Angular. Let me zoom in here for you. So step one, I'm defining the app, and here I've just pulled Bootstrap and Angular down locally to the application. I've got an app, and this time I've given the app a name. So if you saw in the other example, I just tagged it ng-app. Here I'm giving it a name of rate app, putting it in a container. Sometimes I like to do this if false equals true, Angular's not working, because if Angular isn't working, it won't evaluate the expression, and you'll actually see that div and go, hey, something's happening, and then I'm adding the expression. This is all the JavaScript I have. This is just an immediately invoked function expression, which I use just because it's a cool thing to say in a talk. And in that expression, I wire up my Angular rate app module. So modules are containers for applications, basically. So they're standalone containers, but modules can have dependencies on other modules. So I can compose applications or sets of functionality. In this case, I'm not composing anything. That's why this array is empty, because I'm not depending on anything else. And so when I take this little snippet and right-click and view in the browser, you can see a very boring and very small 3 as it evaluated my expression. So we haven't really done much outside of what I showed you live. So now let's go to the second iteration of this, and we're going to load some data. And I'm going to apologize in advance to anyone's bosses out there, because what I decided to use for an example would be, let's say you were toying with the idea of going out and doing contracting or consulting. Well, you want to do some math and figure out, hey, if I work 40 hours a week, 45 hours a week, 50 a week, what will I make weekly, monthly, yearly, and what rates can I charge? So let's start with that concept. So I did the same immediately invoked function expression, passing in this rate app, and this definition here simply gets alias, so I'm passing it in as app just to make it easy to reference throughout. I could have just as easily defined it at the top of this and then var app equals and use that, so just so you know. So what I've done is I've started using Angular's container. Now what I want to point out is on the left side, hours is a tag. It's just a way of naming something that Angular keeps track of. On the right side is that thing it's keeping track of, and you can see here it's just a straight JavaScript array. So we've got 40, 45, 50 hours. Now I've got another value called times, and this is an array of objects. So I've got a description, weekly, monthly, yearly. I'm going to assume in this new consulting lifestyle you're going to take some holidays and 4 weeks of vacation. If you talk to any contractors in the group, they're going to tell you that they've probably worked the past 5 years with no vacation time most of the time, but we can pretend. And then finally, I've got a expression that iterates through rates, and I'm told to adjust for different regions. We could start this lower and end this higher. Just picking 60 through 200 doesn't mean anything. And when we have this range of rates, I'm just pushing it and iterating by 5. So we get 60, 65, 70, etc. I'm assuming you don't need it down to the dollar. Now here's something interesting. So Angular has 2 phases when an app's wired up. It has a configuration phase where you can tweak some dials, and then it has a run phase where you're actually executing the app. So in the run phase, all I'm doing is telling it, take this named thing, which is a container of rates, take this named thing, which is an Angular provided tool used for data binding, and call this function. So this is how we do It's one way of doing dependency injection. Here's my dependencies. I don't care where these were defined, when those were put into the app container. Bring those out and pass them into a function. And this line seems a little redundant, but what I'm doing is I'm taking what you can think of as a corkboard, which is the scope, and that corkboard is where I can stick stuff for data binding. So I'm exposing the rates on that corkboard, if you will. So I've computed them, I've exposed them for data binding, and the data binding happens up here. So see this little expression? So this value of rates is what I'm going to show, and I'm going to pipe it into something called a filter. Because if I just showed it itself, it's actually a JavaScript object, so it doesn't make sense for rendering it. So Angular provides a built-in filter to show it as JSON. So what we see when we run that is we see the JSON representation of all those rates. So far, pretty straightforward. So the next thing we're going to do is create something called a controller. One of the things you don't want to do in Angular is throw everything on your root scope, because applications aren't composed like that. You have different areas that have independent logic, so it's nice to contain those, and our container for that we call a controller. So let's ignore the HTML for now. I'm still wiring up the same values, so I'm putting in hours, times, computing rates, but then I just have one more expression. This is a JavaScript constructor function, and it's taking three values, hours, rates, and times, and it's just setting those properties on itself. So this is a plain JavaScript object. This code, if I injected the hours, rates, and times, has nothing to do with Angular. I could test that in and of and by itself. But what I do is call this special feature of Angular called a controller. I'm giving it this name, passing it the list of dependencies, so it depends on hours, rates, and times, and then this constructor function. So what Angular will do is Angular will look in its Rolodex of all these containers that I've given it, take them, pass them into the constructor function, new it up, and give me that object as a controller. So now when we look at our HTML code, here's what I'm doing. I'm using a new directive called ngController. That allows me to bind controllers to my UI. So I'm saying for this element and its children, we can reference properties on this controller that I created. I'm giving it an alias here. Sometimes you might see this as VM, as viewModel, which is perfectly fine. But that means that whatever Angular has wired up as rate CTRL, I can reference it in my markup as CTRL. And then here I've got the property times on that controller, hours on that controller, and rates on that controller, all exposed through JSON. So again, if we view this in the browser, now we can see we've got three different objects shown. We've got the time factor, the hours, and the rates. So last but not least, let's do something interesting. That's the name of this step. So what we're going to do is extend the controller. Now there's several different ways you can do this. I'm trying to show some patterns. So if you're using TypeScript, for example, TypeScript has a functionality built in that will allow you to inherit from a base class. So you could create your base class, inherit from that. With JavaScript itself in the constructor, you could also do this, this, this. Angular provides a tool called extend that takes whatever object or objects you pass to it and extend this object with what you pass and does all the binding for you. So if you've done a lot of JavaScript, one of the sticky points is what is this within a function? Does this refer to the object? Angular handles that for you. So what I've done is I've created this object just to make it easier to type out, and I'm binding it to the prototype. So anytime an instance of the prototype is created, it will be enhanced with this function and this function. So one of the functions helps me compute what a row looks like with the different hour slots. And one of the functions helps me compute what all the rates are across the board. So if you think about it, I'm going to give you a weekly, a monthly, and a yearly example of this, and then I'm going to break it 40, 45. That's his boss calling, telling him, don't listen to it. You can't, 200 an hour is not realistic. But you're going to have all those time slices, and then we're going to go through and compute them. So again, everything you see here in this object, let me zoom in for you. This is just pure JavaScript, has nothing to do with Angular. You could write this without ever including Angular. But because I've exposed it on the controller, now I can do some interesting things. So I'm going to create a responsive table, that's Bootstrap. I'm going to pull in my controller. I showed you that just a second ago. I'm going to create a table, and this table is going to have 2 rows of headers. The first row is going to iterate through the times and show those times, and those times are the time.time because there's a time factor and a time. Time is the header. Factor is how I do the multiplication for the rate. So all this is doing is showing it. If you're wondering what these weird colons are, that just says data bind once. So Angular out of the box does two-way data binding, and I showed you that in the input box when I typed. It reflected in that H1 tag. So it's watching for changes. But for performance, I'm just showing you a static table. So I'm telling it, once you render this the first time, forget about it. Don't keep watching for changes. That's all that does. Now, I do that header, I do the rate header, and then I'm looping through, so these table rows, for each rate that I have, so 60, 65, 70, I come out here, show the rate, and this is an Angular filter for currency. And then I repeat based on this function call. So that's the function call I showed you down here. I enhance the row that I pass a rate into. It's going to iterate through the different times and factors and actually compute what that value would be, whether it's weekly, monthly, or yearly income. And then this is just exposing it out. So enough talk, let's go ahead and take a look at this in the browser. So what that's given me is a nice formatted table, and you probably can't see the, well you can, the striped rows and everything else. And then you can quickly decide that based on this, I really didn't need to do the table. I want to make 200 an hour and work 50 hours a week, is what's in the lower right for this. So does that make sense, the building blocks of the Angular app? So that was just a quick, easy example, and I tried to save you some of my fumbling and typing on the Surface keyboard for that. But what we learned is you can write these apps fast. And it's particularly powerful, even if you don't implement Angular in your production apps. Consider using it for prototyping, because you can imagine how easy it is to prototype concepts out using Angular. It takes away a lot of your ritual and ceremony. So a lot of the things I would do, for example, in jQuery, finding a div, creating a div, setting the inner text, writing it out, etc., that's gone because it's all part of that data binding template. Modules are the containers for apps, so they're collections of things that can work together, whether it's rates, whether it's controllers, whether it's filters. Services are simply reusable components. So I can create a reusable component, I'm going to show you that in a minute, and plug that into a service. Controllers are just a special type of component that are used for data binding. Directives extend the HTML vocabulary, so that allows me to use declarative markup to extend my application. And I talked about this in my last talk with Kendo UI, and it has a declarative markup built in, but it's much easier to declare your intent in the UI and place a tag based on what you want to do than to do that over here in a separate JavaScript file that's writing code. Because you can see the intent, you can even have your designer go out and say, hey, if you want it to do this behavior, just add this tag and you're good to go. So it allows you to package that up. Filters provide a transformation of data. So that's how I didn't have to do anything for formatting those $ for the currency. The filter did that for me. So why would I use AngularJS? And on the right, it's a picture from downtown Atlanta, but it looks like developers in anguish trying to write web apps. This happened right after, I'm going to say it again, Silverlight was yanked, right? Everyone said, no, what are we going to do? So this is my case study for you. 25 developers. We started a project and ended up being a 3-year project. We started out with JavaScript and Kendo UI. Kendo UI worked great for us. 6 months into the project, we said we're not going fast enough. We need to figure out ways to improve velocity. So we spiked a couple proof of concepts based on technologies we were familiar with, and one of those happened to be a proof of concept with Angular and TypeScript. And we loved it, we implemented it. We ended up writing 80,000 lines of TypeScript code, which generates to usually more JavaScript code. It's more disappointing if you minimize your app because then it's just one line of JavaScript code, so I can't include that statistic. But we had 200 different interchangeable components that worked together in this application over 3 years, global team, and we saw a 4 times improvement. Now, some of that came from TypeScript because it provided a structured way for us to interact with JavaScript without compromising the dynamic nature. Most of that came from Angular and allowed us to coordinate across those teams. So very, very powerful. So the next question is, how does this even work with Kendo UI? When I started working with it, there were no adapters, but we were able to write our own. Now Kendo UI provides this out of the box. So just as a quick look at this, jQuery is a very powerful tool set, and what jQuery does for us is it normalizes the DOM, right? It allows us to write one thing and not worry about how it's implemented on Safari, on Chrome, on Internet Explorer or Internet Edge now, and all these different browsers, and so it creates that normalization layer. Kendo UI is built on top of that, so it takes advantage of that normalization layer and provides these rich widgets. Say that 5 times really fast. Angular doesn't require jQuery, but it uses a similar convention and has its own package, JQLite, basically, that looks like jQuery if it's not there. So it's pretty cool. If jQuery is there, it'll use it. If it's not, it'll fall back to its own implementation. So you've got Angular on one side, you've got Kendo UI on the other side, and then what Kendo UI provides is these set of directives that provide the glue between the two. And I'll show you how that works. So one thing I do want to stress, Angular itself is an open source project. You may or may not know, depending on whether you have licenses now or not, but the Kendo UI core is also open source, which is huge because it means you can grab this core out of the box with Angular and start building these apps with all these building blocks without even going out to grab a license. So on the left side you can see the dozens of widgets, mobile controls, which is what a lot of people are doing, and especially the framework features. So tracking and managing data sources, doing things like drag and drop, globalization support, that's all there in the core. And the key is that the core also has this Angular support. So the Angular directives are part of the core of Kendo UI. They ship with that. Now if you go professional, which was just announced, if you're a Office 365 developer, you will get that out of the box as well. You get these more enhanced widgets such as barcodes, charts, full-fledged, what you see is what you get, HTML editor, all of that comes out of the package. So how does Angular work with Kendo UI? Essentially, Angular and Kendo. So Kendo takes the Kendo widgets that you're used to working with, whether you use the server-side Fluent configuration to expose a widget, whether you're doing it on JavaScript side and using the jQuery method where you grab an element and extend it, or if you're marking it up, no matter what you do, that widget has a name, and what the directives component does is it links an Angular directive to that name and does all the wiring for you out of the box, so you don't have to worry about it. I'll show you what that looks like. Before I do that, though, I do want to show some places where you're not going to have reuse because there's overlap. So Kendo does provide view model and data binding, but if you're going with Angular, you're probably going to use Angular's data binding, so you won't use Kendo's version of that. Angular also has its own routing, and there's 2 types of routes. I think one of them is going to be deprecated, but the UI router is a state-based router that allows for composite regions. So if you have a really rich nested UI, you can use your route to define how that rich UI is rendered and change states and do things with views like that. So it's very powerful functionality. And some of the view and layout features of Kendo are redundant when you go with Angular. They're not needed. Otherwise, I say it's pretty much sky is the limit. If you can do it in one, do it in the other, you can do them together in the application. So let's take a look at the Kendo UI Angular directives. I've got another solution, and the first thing I'm going to do is show you this in the browser. So what I've decided to do is create a health calculator. It's very straightforward. It computes your basal metabolic rate, which for those of you not familiar with that, is pretty much if you're sitting on the couch doing nothing but watching TV all day, that's how many calories you could burn. I see some people taking notes in the back. They're like, this is cool, man. I could watch TV and burn 1,929 calories. So a few things you'll notice. The data may or may not be based on any realities. There could be someone around 200 pounds, 70 inches tall, born in 1974, who has a basal metabolic rate of 1929. The other thing you'll notice, and women always get angry with me about this, but it is true, that if a woman is my size and my weight, she burns less calories at rest. That's a scientific fact. So the BMR is lower when you're comparing height and weight, just to call that out. What we've got is a bunch of nice Kendo UI widgets. And what I can do is I can retype the weight. So let's say because I'm vegan, I can't eat anything, so I suddenly drop to 180. You can see my BMR also dropped. So there's less weight to maintain, so my body burns fewer calories at rest. I could also grow an inch. It could happen. And that would add a full 12 calories to my BMR. Now, if I don't like typing this, I can obviously use the steppers, drop focus, and do it that way. Or I can use these cool sliders, which seem to be all the rage. So we can slide them back and forth, release, and this will update conveniently for us. So there's a few things, and then of course on the birthday, if I wanted to change my birthday, I used to have a friend who always would try to get me in trouble, and I'd say, no, we can't do that, and he'd say, well, what are they going to do, take away your birthday? I was like, they might, you know, never know, so let's just move it back a week. And you can see I'm still 40, so it doesn't really impact the equation there. Now if I were able to, say, move it up to, well anyway, too many months to get to the date I want. So let's take a look behind the scenes at what this looks like in source code. So the first thing you're going to see when I pull this up is a ton of includes. So we've got Kendo pulled in. These are Kendo styles with Bootstrap. Pretty straightforward there. Then we've got our scripts. So we depend on jQuery. So jQuery is going to come into the mix. I've got the minimized version of Angular. I pulled it local to the project to make it easier for you to pull down and play with. And then I've got the Kendo components. Now for this particular example, what you saw is out of Kendo UI Core. So that's out of the box. This is an open source version of the demo. And what I've chosen to do is just pull in the pieces I'm using. So I've got the core, I've got data, numeric text box, slider, etc. I'm going to skip over the HTML for a second, show you the code. Again, in keeping with the way that I like to build Angular applications, and if you're starting Angular now, I think this is very important because it'll make it easier for you to upgrade to Angular 2.0. If instead of throwing something directly in Angular, you think about building it as a standalone JavaScript component and then using Angular to wire it in. So in this case, for example, calculate age, this has nothing to do with Angular. It's just a JavaScript function that will take a birthday, compute an offset, and calculate the age. That's all it does. I can test that and do things with it, plug it into other applications, doesn't require Angular. I've also got a woman and a man function for computing basal metabolic rate. These take in weight, height, and age and spit out those calories. Now I've got my familiar controller, and in the controller I've wired up a default weight, height, and birthday, which this always throws me off, right, with the JavaScript date constructor because it's 0 base, so I have to put in 8 so I can be born in September. Is anyone familiar with object-defined property? Show of hands. Wow, okay, so this is actually one of the biggest concerns I have people raise who have done Angular, and they see the way I do it with controllers, is they say, well, I need the scope. Where is the scope? Because I have to watch for changes on the scope. And I call that an anti-pattern in Angular because when you have a lot of watchers, it can create a lot of overhead. For those not familiar, a watcher, basically when you set up this idea of data binding, you can trigger an event and say, when something changes, why don't you go ahead and notify me so that I can update some logic? So a traditional way to do this would be to say, if the age, so I'd put a watcher on age, or the height, so I'd put a watcher on height, or the birthday, so I put a watcher on birthday, so that's 3 watchers, or you can do an aggregate watcher and like multiply them together or something. But if those change, then I'm going to compute BMR. What I'm doing here is I'm using, I believe this is ECMAScript 5, so it should be pretty much every browser now, to define a property, a getter and setter. TypeScript makes this super easy because you use a get set syntax. If you're doing it with pure JavaScript, this is how you do that. So I'm taking the controller's prototype and exposing a property called male_BMR. So what that'll do is it'll give me a property so I can do this dot male_BMR, and it looks just like a property, but I could give it a getter or setter. I'm just giving it a getter, and in the getter I'm calling my function, that's just a pure JavaScript function, and passing it in the current weight, height, and the result of calculating the age. So with that property, when you access it, it'll do that function on the fly. The reason why this works with controllers is Angular works on something called the digest loop. And it's what's called dirty checking. So what it does is it takes your object that is exposing, and then every time there's a cycle of something changing, it'll walk through your properties and look to see if they changed. And if they changed, it'll re-render the UI. So that's how it knows how to refresh the UI. So typically what's done is that digest loop fires, it sees that height changed, and then you get that event and listen to it. But the reality is, it's already walking through the properties that are data bound. So if I change the height and I change the weight, Angular is going to walk through and ask the controller for every property. So when it asks for this property, and by the way, the model is already mutated, so it's already pushed the values to the model, so the height is updated, it's going to ask it for male BMR. I'm going to compute this on the fly, it's going to recognize a change and data bind it, and I don't have to watch it separately. It's just exposing it as a property makes it work. Same thing with the female BMR, and then I wire in the controller. Now here's something else that's interesting. For my age computation, I used a standalone JavaScript function. I want to expose that as a filter. This is all I had to do to take just a pure JavaScript function and make it something I can embed in the UI, and I'll show you how that's done in a second. So I literally named it age. The function is here so that if I have dependencies, I can inject those dependencies. So if I want to rely on other services, I could list those here and it would pass them to me. And then I return a function that translates the input. So I'm saying given the input, which in this case is a date object, return the output, which is the age. And I turn that in a filter, which is a reusable UI element. This one for the height, this is the Angular way. I'll say I'm embedding it within the filter definition. So this is passing it directly to Angular, saying this filter does this. When we look at our UI, we can now start to see some of the ways these came together. So first, let's take a look at this weight definition. So I've got a label, just like any label you'd normally see. I've got an input, and that input is just like any other input parameter, but now I've enhanced it, and this is the Kendo Angular piece. The way that you take an element and wire it into a Kendo widget is you simply add the attribute Kendo hyphen and then the hyphenated name of the widget. So I want to turn this into a numeric text box. I simply add Kendo hyphen numeric text box, and bam, it turns into a numeric text box. That's all I have to do. The second thing is if there's attributes to set up that text box, you prefix it with a K hyphen and that property name. So if you look at the Kendo UI documentation and it says you can set min, you can set max, you can set step, just put K hyphen min equals in that numeric value, and it will automatically turn that into an attribute. Now keep in mind, these values can also be data bound. So I could expose a property for the range, and let's say I was doing international conversion, then I could change those ranges based on if we're in metric or imperial measurements. This ng model is just telling it to synchronize to weight on my controller, and then I gave it a class for sizing. Same thing with the slider. I've got a div. I use my Kendo-magic to turn that div into a slider. I told it not to place any ticks in it, so tick placement none. Gave it a range, and I just happen to be binding it to the same property. So we can do this and expose inputs in multiple ways that all impact the same property. And then down here I'm just showing weight in pounds, which is just showing the number, nothing interesting. With height it gets a little more interesting. We do the same thing with the text box and the slider, but this time I pass it into my height filter. And what that does is instead of taking this, which is height in inches, it allows it to render as this, which is feet in inches. So any place that I want to show inches as feet in inches, all I have to do is pipe it into this reusable filter and I'm done. For the birthday, all I did was, again, input control. So you can imagine if we didn't have Kendo, it would just fall back to a direct input and work fine. But we enhanced it so when Kendo's in play, it'll actually turn this into a date picker, binding it to the birthday. And then down here, I'm using that age filter. to convert that date to ages old. So again, a reusable filter. Anytime I want to take a date and get an age from that, I can do that. And here are those properties I define, and I expose them just like properties, like anything else. You can see there's no events, no magic, nothing I'm doing to watch. Just by exposing the properties and the formulas, the model will mutate, re-render, and update based on the inputs that I provide. So going back into this, you've seen the functions, the controllers, the definitions, the height, the age. The only other change here is I've named this Kendo demo, and now I'm taking a dependency. This Kendo demo depends on these Kendo directives. So if I were to remove this, then you just get plain input boxes. They'd still data bind and work, but you wouldn't get all the rich feature sets of Kendo controls. So from what I just showed you, Angular and Kendo UI work together seamlessly. You saw that I just tagged it, and boom, data binding through the controls, everything works out of the box. You also learned that if I sat around all day long and did absolutely nothing, I burned 1,930 calories. You don't have to take that in your notes. And they say it's not fair, but just reiterating, the BMR is naturally less. We also learned that Kendo UI provides its own built-in directives, and it's really easy to figure out what they are. If it's in the Kendo documentation, you've got a directive for that widget, and it's Kendo hyphen in the widget name. Kendo widget name to drop in the widget, Kendo widget property to set the widget properties. So now I'm going to go into a quick bonus demo for you. You didn't know you were getting a bonus demo, did you? I bet you didn't know. He looks excited. I hope I live up to expectations. So let me show you this first. So I've taken my app with rates and I've turned it into a grid. And the grid is very shrunk because I've expanded this. So let me zoom out so we can actually see the paging controls. So responsive doesn't necessarily mean responsive to zoom, just to call that out. So we've got the paging like we'd expect. This feels a little redundant. We can sort. It's going to pretty much all sort the same way since it's all ascending. But so a nice grid with paging because we don't necessarily want to scroll off the page. And then I've got a button that if I click this, it'll convert this to a list. Now I do have to call out this is a responsive list. I strained to the limits of my design abilities, getting all those call SM tags with Bootstrap so that if you're on a mobile phone, you can scroll up and down. If you're on an iPad, you get a bigger view. If you're on a larger Windows Surface like I am, then you can get the multiple columns. So it's a responsive output. Now let's look behind the curtain and see what happens. So the first thing I want to show you is that for the application, I'm still using hours, times, rates. So it's the same things that you saw. There is a little bit of a change here where based on the fact that I have monthly, 40, 45 hour, 50, yearly, 40, 45, 50, I'm creating column names. So that's what this convoluted looking code does. Basically does val1 underscore 40, so that means 1 week, 40 hours. Val4 underscore 40, that means a month, 4 weeks, 40 hours. That's all that's doing, and it's just to help the grid. So I'm building those out, and I'm also exposing grid options. And if you work with Kendo grids, you're familiar with grid options. You give it a data source, which in this case I'm just pointing to an array. Give it a page size, sortable, pageable, and the columns are the columns I built out. The other thing I did was I extended the controller to have a flag to tell me whether or not I'm in grid mode, toggle a message to list to grid, and just change that parameter. So I'm just swapping in and out. You click the button, I swap it. I could have put this code in the UI too and saved it on the controller, but it's another excuse to use Angular Extend, which is always fun to do. Then I wired this up. So if we come back up to our UI now, first thing I'm doing up here, so I've got my button, and this is all I need to do to wire it to call that toggle function on my controller. So when you click the button, call the toggle function on the controller. Here, instead of doing a property, I'm actually calling a function and showing the result. So that's the toggle message to list to grid. This is my grid. This is the entire piece of HTML I needed to render that page grid that you saw. I basically took a div, turned it into a Kendo grid, told it to go to the controller for the options, And I set this if tag, and if is important because if this is true, it will render this. If it's false, it will not only not render it, it's not going to hide it, it'll remove it from the DOM so it's not giving me any overhead. So it's a trade-off. If you had a tab feature, you'd probably use an ng show, which will just show and hide because you want to maintain state. Here I'm rebuilding it each time, but it's great for performance if you're going to stay on a screen for a long time. For the list view, this is it right here. This is where I was racking my brain to make it responsive, right? So these are all the Bootstrap responsive classes. But within that, we've got a rate. We expose weekly with these values and currency and everything else. And for the data source here, I'm taking a shortcut and just binding it directly to the array. So I wire the data up on my controller, and here's what's important. In my controller, I can wire the data up, I can test it, and I'm just testing that I have a list of data. In my UI, now I can decide if I want to show it as a grid, as a responsive set of panels. I can change that design, and that controller still maintains its purpose and functionality without having to refactor or change that. So having said that, we've reached the end. I think I'm -3 seconds right now, so I'll do the back of the room question and answer. Please take some time to visit that URL. That's how you can rate me. You can let Telerik know how you feel about this content. You can let me know how to improve it for future talks, so I appreciate you taking the time. And then in the lower corner there, I've got a link to my blog, and then the important one you'll want is this link to Telerik Next 2015. That is the GitHub repository. Forget the ignoring slash. I don't think that's going to work. But GitHub, Jeremy Lickness, Telerik Next 2015, and you'll get the code examples that I just provided for you. So thank you very much. Appreciate you coming out for the session, and enjoy the rest of your time here. It's a great conference.